The child was no older than 7 or 8, and quite the gaunt, small creature. Falling from such a height, his little body was shaking uncontrollably in Shelian's arms, like a newborn animal. However, from that mess of bandages wrapped around his head, peeked a large eye, black in color, reflecting the silhouette of a snow-white figure within, watching him unblinkingly, as if he could no longer see anything else. Loud gasps were heard from all around, and when Shelian raised his head, his heart sank. In his peripheral vision, he saw lying on the ground not far away a golden object. The golden mask that hid his face had fallen. Shelian had landed in the middle of the martial Deity Avenue, and the ceremonial parade was miles behind him, the procession not having made it that far yet. The sudden commotion broke the steady march of the warriors. The flower-tossing celestial fairies looked panicked. The golden carriages stopped. A number of white stallions stomped their hooves and neighed in alarm, and the strings missed notes and their rhythms were disrupted. Some kept going and some stopped. Without being able to coordinate their march again, the entire situation was getting out of control. The crowd on both sides of the street still hadn't had the chance to react, but the king of Shenle, upon the towering platform, stood up immediately, watching his son's silhouette, his expression worried and grave. The moment he stood, how could the rest of the nobles remain seated? Thus they all rose to their feet in a frenzy. The gorgeous bottom had only just warmed his seat, but now it was cold again. He was rapidly thinking whether he needed to prostrate on all fours immediately to beg for forgiveness, and Shirong had already leapt onto the railing, his sleeves rolled up, shouting in rage. "What's going on now? What's happening? Why did the procession fall into chaos? What the hell are you useless trash doing? Did you all eat nothing but plain rice? So dumb that you can't even hold your horses?" The queen's face was pale, her brows slightly knitted, and she hurriedly sent for another to drag him back. The crowds were growing agitated, and a riot was about to erupt, when just then Shelian rose to his feet. Usually, the Honorable Crown Prince was hidden deep within the palace or training at the Royal Holy Pavilion, and rarely had a chance to show his face to the people. This was such a rare occasion that many couldn't help but be intrigued, their gazes all falling on him. Seeing his face, they all held their breath. That young man had long brows and charming eyes, dignified and handsome, radiating nobility, his aura blindingly bright, forcing down the eyes of those looking. With the child in one arm, he raised the other with the sword in hand and pointed it to the grand stage. That ghost had been observing the situation from the stage, and seeing that gesture, he paused for a moment before leaping off the ground. The crowd wowed in amazement as the ghost, his form like a streak of black cloud, flew through the air to the stone pillar where the saber was deeply embedded. He pulled it out from the crack, then flipped again, landing in the middle of the street before the martial warrior. Seeing that he instantaneously understood his intentions and came forth to cooperate, Shelian lauded under his breath, "Good, Mu Cheng." Now, both the god-pleasing martial warrior and the ghost had descended from the stage. One black, one white. Saber and sword clashed once again, heightening the excitement, electrifying the crowd. Upon the towering platform, the faces of nobles finally relaxed, looking appeased. The ghost feigned the act to aim for the child in the warrior's arms, with both his hands holding the saber. Gripping it to his side, he rushed towards Shelian. The two faked parrying, move after move, strike after strike. Then they leapt back onto the stage anew. While the crowd was distracted, Mu-Ching used the chance to do a somersault onto the street, grabbed the mask, then dashed through the procession, urging in a low voice, "Don't scramble, compose yourselves. Pretend that nothing's happened and continue the march. Finish marching this round and return to the palace." All within the procession immediately steadied and returned to their posts, their spirits renewed. The moment Mu-Ching returned to the stage, his attacks became even more vigorous, clinking and clanking, Xie receiving more slashes. Just then, the child in his arms cried out, probably terrified of being struck between the clashing weapons. Xie left hand held him tighter, and he whispered, "Don't be scared." Hearing his words, the small child gripped onto the folds of his robes at his chest. Even with the child in one arm and the other handling a sword, Xie was still fighting with ease. After parrying for a while, he felt the child in his hold raise his trembling arms and grab hold of his shoulders in a deathly grip, as if he were hanging on for dear life. Xie soothed again, "Don't worry, nothing will hurt you." After speaking those words, Xie called in a low voice, "Mu-Ching." The ghost facing him inconspicuously inclined his head, and Xie struck. Thus, before the eyes of millions, the God-pleasing martial warrior pierced the heart of the ghost, slaying it on the spot. Mu-Ching, with his ghost mask on, clutched his wound, stumbled back a few steps, struggled for a moment, before finally, with a thud, he fell to the ground and stopped moving. On the platform above, Qirong laughed out loud, applauding. "Dead, he's dead. Cousin Crown Prince has slain the ghost dead." While all this was happening, the magnificent heavenly procession had continued to march, and soon moved onto the path back to the palace. Because of how well the act was saved, and how the unexpected improvised act was exhilarating to watch, not only did the people not complain, but rather their excitement grew stronger. Countless within the crowd were shouting, "Your Highness," and hollering, "God." And followed behind the grand stage, thousands upon thousands, rushing to the palace. A few of the generals had to send out many more troops of warriors and soldiers to block the overly excited people. However, in the end, they still couldn't hold them back, and the crowd broke through, pushing themselves toward the palace gates. The king of Shenle called from the top of the towering platform, "Guards, warriors." At the same time, the hundreds within the procession had all re-entered the palace, and the giant crimson gates closed soundlessly shut after the grand stage. The colorful banners of the performance were now out of sight. The people rushed the gates, knocking and slapping upon it, their cheers ringing to the heavens. Inside the tightly closed palace gates, upon the grand stage, the white-clad, God-pleasing martial warrior and the black-clad ghost both threw their weapons onto the ground before collapsing heavily on the ground. Xie was covered in sweat and ripped open layers and layers of his elegant costume before exhaling deeply. "That was close, too close. I'm exhausted." Mu-Ching removed his heavy ghost mask and let out a long breath silently, but didn't complain about being tired. When he looked over, he saw that Xie was still holding onto that young child and frowned wordlessly. Feng Xin, on the other hand, called out as he followed after the grand stage in a jog, "Your Highness, what are you doing, bringing the child in too?" That young child was lying on Xie chest, his small body frozen and unmoving, afraid to even breathe loudly. Xie sat up. What was I to do? Throw him back out onto the streets? It's a mess out there. He's such a tiny creature. He'd get trampled to death. He held up the small child and patted his head, asking casually, "How old are you, little guy?" That child didn't blink, and his lips uttered no sounds. Xie continued his query, how did you come to fall earlier? Your Highness, the child probably doesn't dare to speak. He's obviously scared witless, Mu Ching said. Shilin patted the head of that young child again, but his unresponsiveness made him lose interest, so he stopped patting. So silly, Shilin commented. Fengxin, when you get a chance, go and find someone to take him out through the side doors and check if he's injured. His head is wrapped in bandages. All right, Fengxin extended his hand. Give him to me. Shilin held the young child up and passed him over, but before he could do so, Fengxin said, Your Highness, why haven't you let go? I did let go. Shilin was puzzled, but when he looked down, he laughed exasperatedly. Turns out it was the child, who was still gripping tightly onto his clothes, refusing to let go. A few were taken aback and started laughing out loud. While training at the Royal Holy Pavilion, so many devotees, men and women alike, tried their hardest to get a glimpse of Shilin, whether it be out of curiosity or devotion. But when they'd seen him once, they'd want to see him again. If they could train next to him, then even better. They couldn't believe that a child at such a young age would also be the same. Guarding the grand stage were many young trainees from the Royal Holy Pavilion, and they all snickered. Your Highness, this child doesn't want to leave. Shilin also laughed. Is that right? That won't do. I've got my own things to do. Go home, little kid. Hearing this, the child finally slowly loosened his grip, letting go of Shilin's clothes, and Fengxin picked him up. Even when the person holding him was now Fengxin, the child was still staring at Shilin with his large, dark eye, looking as if he was possessed. Many who were witnessing this started muttering silently, noting that intense stare. Shilin himself, however, wasn't even looking at the child anymore, and only spoke to Fengxin directly. Don't pick him up like you're picking up trash. You're scaring him. Fengxin put the child back down on the ground. Enough joking around. Guo is freaking out. Your Highness better think about how you're going to face him later. Hearing this, everyone stopped laughing. An hour later, at the Royal Holy Pavilion, on the martial deity summit, inside the great martial hall, clouds of incense wafted in the air, and the sound of chanting came in waves. Guo and the 3 other deputy Guo sat in a line by the side wall within the great hall, their faces clouded. Mu Ching was kneeling before them. Shilin was also kneeling, but before him was nothing but the golden statue of the martial heavenly emperor. Fengxin followed his master and knelt behind him. Guo picked up that exquisitely crafted golden mask, and after a moment he heaved a heavy sigh. Your Highness, Your Highness. Even when kneeling, Shilin's back was straight, his posture perfect, and his head raised. Present, he responded. Guo looked pained. Do you know that in the history of Shenle, having held so many Shangyuan heavenly ceremonial processions, never once did the grand stage only circle the capital thrice. Thrice. Every ritual of the Shangyuan heavenly ceremonial procession, every decoration in every place had a meaning behind it. To have the grand stage circle the capital once symbolized the kingdom's prayer for the peace and happiness of the people for 1 year. Thus, however many rounds the grand stage made, meant however many years another such grand ceremony need not take place. Not only did this signify good fortune, it also saved money. Having only made 3 rounds, didn't that mean that the kingdom would only be protected for 3 years? The worst thing was that on top of that, the golden mask on the face of the God-pleasing martial warrior had fallen mid-ritual. Since ancient times, the people of Shenle had believed that the spiritual aura of a person resided upon the 5 facial features. The spirit of a person was on their face, and the best must be offered to the heavens. Thus, in the midst of a ceremony, the martial warrior must wear a golden mask to hide their features, because his face could only be appreciated by the gods, and mortals had no right to see it. Guo was both furious and disappointed. The god-pleasing martial warriors of the past circled the capital at minimum 5 times, at most 15 or 16 times. You can do 50 with your eyes closed, 100 even. But you killed yourself dead after 3. Why didn't you just kill me, your master, first? Now look at you. Our dear Highness, the Crown Prince, is going to go down in history, dragging me along with him. No one dared to speak in the great hall, yet Shilian still looked to be at ease and calmly responded. Guo, why don't you look at it this way? If that child had fallen to his death with no one to catch him, spilling blood on the path of the procession, wouldn't that be equally ominous? Wouldn't the parade still have to come to a stop? At the very least, the ceremony ended decently, and it was the best case scenario. Let's just call what happened an accident. For a moment, Guo's words were stuck in his throat, but then he blew up. You child, with so many royal guards on site, anyone could have caught him. Even if the catch is off and he breaks an arm, he wouldn't have died. You could have just marched forward a few steps, performed a little flashier, and everyone would forget whoever had fallen and move on. Shilian raised his brows. Guo, you understand as well as I do. Under those circumstances, no one else but me could have reacted as fast, and there was no second person who could have caught him without injury. Let him fall, there'd be 1 dead. Catch him, and there'd be 2 dead. His words were confident and self-assured. The 4 Guo also knew that what he said was true, and couldn't refute it. But seeing him kneel before the statue of God, looking like all was well and nothing was the matter, Guo was angry, amused, and proud. Before his precious, darling disciple, he just couldn't get angry, and could only pull at his own hair, using the pain of his scalp to relieve the worry in his heart. After a pause, Guo spoke again. Another thing. Shilian inclined his head. This disciple is listening. You did well today on stage, Guo said, but no matter how well you performed, you can't just suddenly change things up right before the start without a word of warning. Both majesties were terrified by your act today. Do you know what would have happened if we missed the fortuitous hour? Shilian knitted his long brows, looking puzzled. Guo, with regard to this, hadn't I already asked for your permission before today? Guo was taken aback too. You asked already? Before today? When? Bewildered, Shilian turned his head and looked, calling out, Mu Ching.